Hi, and welcome to Access Chat. Today, delighted to have Jim Tobias with us. You'll notice that Jim is still, so he's only audio, but still with us nonetheless. Jim, I'm really pleased to have you with us. I was particularly interested in the talk that you gave to the Funka conference in Stockholm earlier this year. Was really fascinated at some of the themes that you were exploring around different ways of viewing accessibility. So we'll explore them shortly. But can you give me a bit of background as to how you came to work in this field? Because I know you've been working in it a long time, because your name's cropped up ever since I started. So welcome, and tell us a bit more about how you ended up working in accessibility.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Neil, and everyone else from Access Chat. Very happy to have this opportunity. And you're right, I have been doing this for a very long time, and I guess with the opportunities that come with age, it's always time to think back of what it all meant as one's career reaches some kind of end anyway. So I do think a lot about the theory and the framework of accessibility. Just a little bit of background. I began at the Center for Independent Living in Berkeley, California in 1977. It was at that time the only independent living center of its type. That is, it was run and managed entirely by people with disabilities. Very much a political and policy advocacy organization. But I worked on the practical side of things. I did wheelchair repair and van modifications and workplace modifications and home modifications. And I walked around all day with a tool belt and a soldering iron and that kind of stuff. And installed electric door locks in people's houses and what have you. And I did that for about 3 years and then moved east and very quickly got involved in the Bell system. So I worked with folks at Bell Labs and then joined them, Bell Labs and Bellcore, for about 10 or 12 years. Then in 1995, I went out on my own as Inclusive Technologies, specializing much more in information and communication technologies, phone systems, communication systems, software, and the web as it developed. And I've been involved more and more in research and development projects and in policy about accessibility over those years as well. So it's kind of moved from the soldering iron to the signing pen of laws like the CVAA, the Communication and Video Accessibility Act of 2010.
Okay, brilliant. And I've actually got videos and stuff that you and tutorials you've given, which I still play to people even now. One particular favorite of mine is the explaining the VPAT that you've done. Because so many people fall foul of the whole, yeah, we're 508 compliant, have a form. So I'm really pleased to have you here. But
Well,
the stuff,
just a word on that. I would probably hate to see that video, so please don't offer to share it with me. But at any
I will.
rate, I have to say one other thing about my approach, that I try to keep things light and kind of rich media. So I put together a child's book called VPAT the Bunny in the early days of the VPAT. That was, just like Pat the Bunny, with little things you could touch and feel, like simulated BS in that book. And I also had a Section 508 Magic 508 ball, which was a folding cardboard thing that had all of the provisions of Section 508 in something, and you could play with it and kind of figure out what you were going to do to comply with it. So thank you for the trip down memory lane, but let's stay in the present and go into the future.
Oh, I think I'd quite like to digitize up the VPAT Magic 8 Ball. I think that would
Great,
be
great.
a or the 508 ball. Yeah, that would be fantastic. Actually, I think I'd like that because I'm working a lot with our procurement teams at the moment. So that's interesting. But the thing that really got me interested, and what you were talking about in Sweden, was the idea of um, looking at accessibility in a very different way. So you talked about how inaccessibility could be viewed as analogous to environmental issues, and you talked about inaccessibility, effectively being a pollution. It's a byproduct that affects people in a negative way, but it's often not intentional. So, can you tell us a bit more about how you came to this thinking and explain a bit more? Because I thought this was really interesting.
Sure. I think it's a useful analogy that gives us, it's not just a way to hang the issue on some existing, mental hardware and furniture that we have, but it's actually useful for analysis and for understanding what are some successful approaches to solving the problem. So if we were to look back at the environmental movement of the late 60s and early 70s, we'd see the same kind of things, the same levels of outrage and the same understanding that, hey, we have to test the soil and the air and the water to find out, and where did this stuff come from, and how these people don't want to ruin the reputation of their company, but they are right now. How can we find our allies in those companies? How can we work with laws and regulations? And we've really gone down, in a lot of ways, the same pathway. But I have to say, honestly, that it arose from some economic studies that I was doing at Belcor, where I was in a market research and analysis organization, looking at what economists call externalities, which is just a fancy way of saying something about a product that has an effect that's not involved in the pricing of it. So it's something that's not in the market side of the product, but it's in the reality of the product. So we had no environmental laws, and we were having this, let's say, a negative health effect that nobody was paying for except, the people who were suffering from it. And accessibility, exactly as you say, is kind of the same thing, or inaccessibility. It's inadvertent. People are not trying to exclude people with disabilities. They're just trying to make a product or a service, and they don't recognize right away that it has this socially exclusive effect. And we have to figure out how to raise that issue with them, and how to raise the price, how to take that external cost and push it back into the product somehow. So the company either lowers the inaccessibility or pays the freight for the inaccessibility that they've caused. And of course, we want them to do the former. We want them to reduce the inaccessibility. And this is just a nice way of linking up with these other issues. And pollution is one, and nutrition is another, and public health is another. There's a lot of different ways of looking at inaccessibility as a social issue and something that causes a social cost. And it's worth looking at that, again, not just to have another arrow to shoot at somebody, but to get very specific and very quantified in terms of what is the actual cost, and how can we attribute that cost, and how can we drive the cost to the entity that's causing the cost rather than these other, innocent bystanders.
Yeah. So I think that certainly in terms of environmental costs, we're seeing quite a lot of that now. You see a lot of this built into the legislation in manufacturing and so on. So you've got in Europe, we've got what's called the WEEE directive, which is waste electrical equipment and something I can never remember the last E. But basically, it builds in the cost of recycling and dealing with the difficulties of disposal of some of this quite often hazardous materials and rare earth materials that get built into your consumer electronics. So
exactly right. Yeah.
So how do you think we can get to a point where we're doing similar stuff to make stuff accessible?
Well, I think we are in many ways, and I would say that my experience, not just with Access Chat, but with many of the similar forums for discussing accessibility, there's a lot of enthusiasm and energy and awareness and recognition of the problems. There are even a lot of technical solutions out there, and it's a very lively, because technology changes so much, it's a very lively constant turmoil of problems and solutions. And we've had great success in the policy field as well. You know, there's a lot of things about accessibility, or let's say the exclusion of people with disabilities, that just can't be argued against in public. You know, in the environmental movement, people who want to hold back environmental regulations say, well, it's going to cost jobs, or it's going to cut back the economy. It's very hard to make that claim about, you know, people with disabilities. It's just, you know, just inhumane to make a claim like that, that excluding these folks, you know, they're not worth it. Nobody would make that claim. So we have some advantages in being able to do that. I do think, however, that we need to, and there are signs of this happening, we need to take that more seriously and move from kind of a loose movement with some professionalization to a much more self-aware movement, self-aware, developing social policy structure. And as I say, there are, you know, signs of it. There's one right over your shoulder, Business Disability Forum, a great organization, has done wonderful stuff on accessibility. So we need to do just more and more of that, and maybe a little bit less of the kind of preachy, you know, preaching to the choir that we spend so much time doing, you know, just reasserting the, you know, how noble the cause is, and that's important to do and keep the enthusiasm up, but we need to kind of nail it down a little bit more, and that's one of the things that quantifying issues can sometimes help with, because you're talking about specifics, you know, specific costs, specific benefits, and you know, it kind of gets everyone focused in on the practicalities, and I think it can be a good direction to go in.
Deborah, I know you have a question. But you're on mute.
Thank you, Neil. I'm but I'm going to just keep going. So you're talking about quantifying it, and also I think you bring up a good point about, you know, having the same discussions over and over, but there's still an amazing large amount of people that still don't seem to understand why accessibility is so important for everybody, including people with disabilities and people that are aging and acquiring disabilities. So I know at Access Chat, we've been doing Access Chat for 2.5 years, every single week. We've had guest topics, and we still have a lot of people that come to us and say, wow, I never thought of that, and I never considered those things. And so I think a lot of work still needs to be done of educating people, especially, you know, technologists that are building technology and forgetting to make it accessible. But would you mind elaborating a little bit more on your how you're talking about quantifying, because it's because we're talking about technology and communications, and we're talking about so many moving parts. I found often that it's been hard to quantify it.
Thanks. That's a great question, and you're absolutely right. There's no need to back off on the evangelism. I think evangelism is always right to do, but it's a question of knowing your audience. So I know, having been in the Bell system and talked as an internal person, not an external advocate, that some of the skepticism about accessibility, and this remains true with many of my corporate clients, is at the level of people who are implementers, not decision makers. So, you know, an executive, issues management person, someone on the, you know, what you might call the regulatory or soft government affairs side of a business has the freedom to kind of say, oh, I love this idea, it's a great idea, but and then they hand the the docket off to the poor product manager who has to make sense of it in day-to-day terms, and they're not always sure. You've heard the same complaints as I have. What does it mean to be accessible? When do I know that the job is done? Is cost really not allowed to be a factor? What's the most important problem I should solve first? These are really hard, and we're not always good at giving the best guidance. So as part of our evangelism, and I think you're a perfect example of it, Deborah, is pairing up mentors in companies with new entrants so that they know that it's not impossible, it's not an endless struggle, you can succeed, you can have a successful product, and it's down at that practical level. Okay, how do you do customer support for deaf customers? How do you add how do you notify people of new accessibility features? How do you do testing on accessibility, not just with screen readers? And it's those kind of details that are important to have in the near term, and they're also very reassuring, because if you see someone succeeding, you're going to say, well, we're maybe not in the lead of the pack, but we're going to get, if we follow this leader, we'll get where we need to be, and we don't have to, turn our business inside out.
That's a really excellent point, Jim, when you talked about mentoring the people in the different areas and sharing with each other. And I know you mentioned the Business Disability Forum, and I know there's other organizations globally that are doing it, but I find that that's always the most impactful way. I'll also just state, since you brought up Bell Labs, some people are military brats. I'm a Bell brat. Both of my parents worked for AT&T when it was all one big Bell and AT&T, and then my husband worked for Southern Bell, and I worked for Southern Bell, so got a lot of Bell experience in my family. And I've learned a lot about strategy and processes and things like that, which I think we need to apply more to accessibility than just advocacy. I agree with you. I'm a big advocate and big influencer with this, but if we don't tie it truly effectively into the process and really get the people that are going to have to do it, everybody on the same page and learning from each other, I think we're going to continue to not see the advancements that I think that we still need to see in the area, the innovations, the advancements. I mean, not always just having the compliance discussions like we are so often in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely agree. Just to say a little bit more about that, because you had asked about, how do you quantify? Again, it's, kind of understanding the context that you're in. If you were, if you're talking with a large software company, they're going to have a much better understanding of global marketing, let's say. So you can talk to them about multiple environments and the different ways that accessibility is viewed, both culturally and legally in different environments. But if you go, you should change your slide deck if you're talking to a small web development firm in Cincinnati. So you have to understand, well, who's your customer? You have to understand their business and all of the things that we need to we need to focus in on to make it clear that we're not there as the preacher, we're there as the the helper.
Yeah, I think that's really crucial, and I have to say that I have to change my pitch depending upon who I'm talking to. I think it's really crucial that you use the language of the profession or the project group or the board level people so that you're pitching it right. So I do change my pitch. I also think that I'm totally with you. There's a lot around process that we need to be doing. It's the sharing that and the sharing the know-how. And some of this stuff, it's not rocket science. It's not even about standards. It's about how do we do this? What are the practical things that we can do that have made some projects work and others fall on their faces?
Well, this is why I think quantification works
Yeah.
in our favor for a particular audience, and that audience is, you know, product managers and market managers who have their analogs in the public sector as well. You know, everyone wants to know how many people is this going to affect, what's the value compared to the other things that we're thinking about doing, and to have some numbers behind it, you know, some real numbers. And I have to say, you know, I've been in too many presentations where, you know, we talk about 54 million Americans or, you know, 1 billion people with disabilities worldwide, and those numbers are true, but they're not relevant to every situation. So if we're talking about captioned video, right, what I want to see us do is, okay, here's the intended beneficiaries, people who are deaf or hard of hearing, who we know right now use captions when they watch a video. We have numbers like that. And then in addition, we lay on numbers that are kind of like a universal design halo effect that says, here are English language learners. How many people are, you know, instructed to watch captioned videos at home when they're learning English as a new language? How many young people are learning, you know, 3, 4, and 5-year-olds learning reading via captions? You know, the bars, the sports bars, the quiet offices that need to watch TV, all of those, you can say them qualitatively, but when you say them quantitatively, it all of a sudden has a credibility that it wouldn't have otherwise. And you could go through, and actually think this is a good exercise, go through all of WCAG 2.0, pick out each and every one of the success criteria, and identify where you can, because you can't do it everywhere, but where you can, identify those universal design halo beneficiaries and put those in the mix when you talk about WCAG. And you say, look, you're going to have to swallow the whole package. There's nothing we can do about that. But here's the benefit of this particular feature for people without disabilities that you and your developers probably haven't thought about. So again, it's, you know, use numbers when they're valuable. Don't make them up. Don't exaggerate them. Just, you know, do them to show that you have that credibility of what your enterprise customer is trying to solve.
I think that's really interesting. I'm particularly interested in the idea of attaching numbers to success criteria. I'd be really interested to see what the numbers would be for some of the AAA stuff.
Yeah.
Because actually, I think that everyone goes, oh, AAA, too hard, too hard, too expensive. But if you start attaching the numbers to it, because obviously the AAA is the intersection, effectively, with usability a lot of the time.
Absolutely. Absolutely, 100%. And yet, you know, on the other hand, I guess you have to look at features like the language of the document and say, I'm not so sure this is a mainstream feature. And, you know, it's not that I'm disagreeing with the guideline. I'm just saying sometimes you win and sometimes you lose, and we have a lot more wins that we haven't picked up on. And let's run through all of those wins and get them out there.
Yeah. Oh no, I think that's right. I think with some of the technical accessibility elements, yes, you've got smaller numbers, but you've got people that just manifestly couldn't do stuff if you didn't do it. So that's why it's there. But equally, what I want to encourage people to do is not stop at AA, because that's the sort of compliance mentality. Yeah, so right, we've done AA, that's it, done, dusted, job done, next thing. And I think that we want to give people really good experiences. It's not about just accessible experiences, it's about good experiences. So particularly AAA, particularly the stuff that's easy to understand and makes it good for people with cognitive difficulties. There's a benefit there, but
Exactly.
actually quantifying that benefit would be really useful. So
yeah.
I don't know whether you've just made a rod for your own back, Jim, or if I'm making it for you. But I'm expecting to see a fantastic presentation next year at Funker 17.
Well, as long as it has your name on it, I'm fine.
Oh no, I was going to get Susanna to.
Well,
to
I mean,
invite
actually, seriously, I think this is something that deserves some follow-up. I've had just to raise a practical issue, about quantification and costs and benefits. The federal government, for new laws and new regulations, has to do a regulatory impact analysis. This is a U.S. Rule. And there's one being done for Section 508 right now, and I would say it's quite poor. It really doesn't look at it does a better job of assessing potential costs than benefits. So it's a little bit off kilter right there. But even on both sides, it's just missing a lot of it, and a little bit of community building around responses to those analyses, saying, hey, no, there's a bigger picture here that justifies these regulations, and even though we're not, just looking at compliance, we need to push back when there's penny pinching going on that is not only a disservice to people whose participation is jeopardized, but it's bad economics, it's bad science, it's bad public policy.
Excellent. Antonio, I know you've got a question.
Yes, I do. No, we have been talking. I think, no, after all, what we are talking here is about the right of people to be able to participate in the democratic society as full members. So from the moment that there are restrictions to the way how people participate, it basically you are excluding their voices and their ways to be part of the society that they are living in. So I think that's one of the principles is when you are in the building of building a democratic society, accessibility and allowing all the members to be able to participate as much as they can in similar circumstances is a very important element that cannot be ignored.
I agree, and I agree both at the philosophical level, as you stated, and even at the economic level. So the other side of externality theory, the benefit side, not the cost side, the positive externality is every network grows in value the more participants it has. So we know this with the internet. If the internet was only two people sending, whatever back and forth, nobody would bother with it. But every new user creates new value, creates new content, creates new opportunities for communication and sharing and exploring and developing. And that can be quantified. That's an economic issue, and positive externalities, very key part of understanding who's not participating now and how much value they would add if they were allowed to participate. So 100%, yeah, absolutely agree.
I think you brought it's such a good point that you brought up, Jim. I have a podcast, and I was interviewing somebody the other day, and he said something that just really, really resonated with me. Doug Forresta was my guest, and he said, what if that person that has cerebral palsy and maybe can't speak? My chief accessibility officer, Mary Musacchio, cerebral palsy, and she can verbalize, but she can't speak, but she uses a communications device to get her brilliant words out. And he said, what if that person that you're leaving out is going to cure cancer, or finally cure AIDS, or build something that could help us turn dirty water into fresh water. You don't know what abilities people have if we don't allow them to participate, if we don't allow them to communicate, and we right now as society still we're holding people with disabilities back by not including them in the technology age and the communications age, and something you had said earlier on I wanted to come back to, because I've seen some of it, and I think it's so brilliant. I know in the United States for a while, we started, everybody was using the same numbers, and the numbers could not be grounded. There are 54 million Americans. Now, you can ground that with our Census Bureau, but 220 billion discretionary dollars. Okay, ground that for me. Was that before our financial crisis? After, blah, blah, blah. And you're leaving all this money on the table. Really, will quantify that for me. Help me understand why. Are you telling me, Miss Advocate with Disabilities, that if I don't make my technology accessible, that I'm going to lose customers? If I do, I'm going to gain customers. We just haven't seen good quantifications. There's been some good work done. I recently saw something that actually Neil was in that Forrester did, and I saw some work Gartner has done and some other work that's been done. But I think I really like what you're saying and agree with you, Jim, when you're talking about quantifying. Instead of how many people in the world are deaf, how many people, and even all of those numbers are really good, but how many people use captioning? In my house, just as one family. I'm a middle-aged woman married to a middle-aged man. I have 2 grown children. My daughter with Down syndrome actually uses captioning to help her comprehend the programs and to practice her reading. My husband is losing his hearing pretty dramatically. He is definitely hard of hearing, and we are shopping for hearing aids. And so he has captions on all the time. People that visit that Spanish is their first language instead of English like the captioning. So and there's been some studies done that say that when a video is captioned, more people watch it and comprehend it better. So I think that we need to do more of that when you talked about that earlier, and that is, once again, explaining how everyone in society benefits from things are accessible. And how could you, I think most of the people I've trained over the many years I've been in this field, none of them wanted to leave anybody out. A lot of them just didn't know, and sometimes the conversation is so compliance driven, or let's talk about 1194-21. Oh, I just went into legislation in Section 508, or the WCAG, and we seem to complicate it so much instead of giving good, solid, quantifiable data. And by the way, if you're in the United States and you're in business and you're putting any kind of technology out there, it's very clear that you're going to do this or you're going to get sued. And I'm sorry that we sue people so much in the United States, but it's how we get things done. And so, and the world is actually benefiting from a lot of this litigation that's happening. But I just wanted to comment on that line that you were going, Jim, because I think it's a really, really important point.
Thanks. And I would just want to say one thing to extend it a little is the audience factor. So we've got this great potential for great information about quantification on a feature-by-feature basis, as you say, rather than a person-by-person basis. But where does that go? If it's only in our community, it's not reaching who it needs to reach. It needs to go out to the Product Development and Management Association, the Society for Human Resources Management meetings. We have to get out of our little comfortable circle and talk. If we're going to talk their language, let's go to them and talk their language. They're not always going to show up at our doorstep. So a lot of it is, again,
well said.
What the environmental movement had to go through. They couldn't just talk within the Sierra Club, right? They had to get out there and get to the junior high schools where kids were, so eager to absorb the environmental message. Well, look at the opportunities we have. Every junior high and high school student has technology and social implications requirements in their in education. We could show up at any middle school in this country, in any country, not just the U.S., and say, we'd like to come in as a guest speaker about usability and accessibility and how the products that you use every day, some are hard to use, some are easy, and it's because they were designed. And what can we do to understand those products and how the technologies work and all of that? We've got, 40 million students in the U.S. alone ready to hear that message. So it's, kind of getting out there a little bit more. as we can.
I think
Yeah,
that's really
well
important.
said, Jim.
So I'm totally with you. We need to be not preaching to the choir. We need to be going out and to a certain extent, not. It's great to go to an accessibility conference, hear people tell you new stuff about accessibility, but also it's equally important to be taking that message to other conferences, to be going and talking, as you say, to your HR department. They're usually on board. But they don't know how. So it's coming to them with the know-how, giving them the confidence that this is not, as Gareth Ford Williams says, a dark art. I love that. But something that is doable, is possible to do, it's cheaper to do it up front. And as you say, it's in the design. And where stuff comes unstuck, it's usually because you haven't thought about it. Design phase is right at the beginning. And usually where it gets difficult is where you're trying to unpick or supplement the designs that have not considered this stuff. I think we're at the end of our half hour, but so it's been a fascinating chat. I've got more ideas now running around my head than I had when we started, which is always a good thing. So thank you very much, Jim, and look forward to chatting to you on Twitter tomorrow night.
Well, it's been a great session for me too, and I'm really looking forward to the Twitter session. So thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.